December 22nd, 1944, Bastogne, Belgium. Snow drifted across the ruined streets like ash falling from a dying fire. The siege had entered its 7th day. The town, once filled with laughter and church bells, now lay silent under a sky the color of iron. Somewhere beyond the tree line, German artillery whispered its constant threat, and the ground trembled with each distant impact. Inside a shattered farmhouse overlooking the road to Noville, Sergeant Jack Donovan of the 101st Airborne crouched beside a broken window, his gloved hands wrapped around an M1 Garand that was unlike any other in the Ardennes. The men around him called it the Monster Garand. They didn't know why it sounded different when it fired. They didn't ask. In Bastogne, questions didn't matter. Survival did. But that rifle, that strange, thunderous rifle, would soon become the dividing line between life and death. Before Bastogne, Donovan had been a machinist in Detroit, working long nights under the fluorescent hum of the Ford Rouge plant. He could read metal like another man read books, knew its moods, its weaknesses, the way it sang when struck just right. When the war came, he traded his tools for a rifle. But his hands never forgot the rhythm of creation. To him, every mechanism had a soul, and every weapon a secret waiting to be uncovered. If you love stories like this, real courage, real history, then don't just watch, become part of it. Subscribe now to WW2 Frontline Legends and stand with the people who keep this history alive. Every like, every share, every comment helps us honor those who lived these moments and shows your support for the hard work that goes into bringing these forgotten stories back to life. So hit that subscribe button, join our community, and tell us where you're watching from. Together, we're not just remembering history, we're keeping it alive. It was in the hedgerows of Normandy that he first noticed the flaw. During a firefight outside Corentin, his Garand had jammed mid-volley, the recoil spring failing to reset in time. A half-second delay. But in war, half a second was the difference between breathing and being buried. That night, in a rain-soaked barn, he stripped the rifle down to its skeleton. The parts lay scattered before him like a puzzle. He studied the sear notch, the disconnector, the trigger's rebound, and saw something no one else had noticed. A tiny adjustment to timing, just a fraction of a millimeter, could allow the trigger to reset itself faster. Not automatic, but close. Controlled, efficient, devastating. He worked by candlelight, filing the steel with careful strokes, listening to the scrape as though the metal itself were whispering back. When the modification was complete, he loaded a single clip, stepped outside, and aimed into the darkness. 8 rounds thundered out in under 2 seconds. The muzzle flash lit the rain like lightning. For a moment, he stood frozen, stunned by what he had just done. The next morning, a passing ordnance officer, Major Hale, heard the rapid bursts and stormed over, demanding to know what weapon he was firing. Donovan hesitated. He tried to explain, tried to show that it wasn't automatic, that it still required a trigger pull for every shot. Hale's eyes narrowed. "You just turned a service rifle into a machine gun," he said. "That's tampering with government property." Donovan's explanation fell flat. The officer threatened court-martial. But later that night, Hale found him alone in the tent, still disassembling the rifle. He didn't arrest him. He simply said, "Keep it quiet, Sergeant. One day, that thing might save your life." Then he walked away into the fog. Months passed. The war moved eastward, and so did Donovan. By December, he and his squad found themselves trapped in Bastogne, cold, hungry, outnumbered, and forgotten. The snow piled higher each day, and the enemy pressed closer with every sunrise. The forests echoed with the crunch of German boots, and the horizon burned with muzzle flashes. Still, Donovan's men held the line, dug into their foxholes, their faces gray with exhaustion. The nights were the worst. Frost crept through torn gloves, fingers stiffened, breath froze on the inside of helmets. Men whispered to keep from going mad, and always above the wind came the low growl of approaching armor. The 101st was surrounded, cut off from supplies, from command, from hope. But for Donovan, there was something else, a quiet conviction, a machine-like calm born from years at the bench. He'd faced pressure before, steel only hardened under heat. Inside that farmhouse, Donovan stared at his rifle in the dim glow of a dying fire. The Garand was standard issue, yes, but not this one. Inside its trigger housing lay the secret that could tip the balance. It wasn't legal. It wasn't approved. But neither was freezing to death under German shells. He pulled a small screwdriver from his kit and adjusted the spring tension. The motion practiced and smooth. Private Brooks watched from across the room. "You really think that trick of yours can hold him off?" Donovan didn't answer. He only said, "It's not the rifle that matters. It's what you do with it when it counts." Outside, the wind howled like a living thing. German loudspeakers broadcast surrender demand through the forest, their voices distorted by static. "Bastogne is surrounded. Lay down your arms, Americans." The only reply was the whistle of incoming mortars and the shattering of glass. Donovan moved to the window, scanning the treeling. Through the scope, he saw movement, dark shapes weaving between snowdrifts. Infantry. Dozens of them, maybe more. He felt the familiar calm settle over him, the machinist's clarity, the world narrowing to gears, angles, and timing. His heartbeat slowed. The rifle rested perfectly against his shoulder. He thumbed the safety off. The first burst cracked through the air like lightning. 8 rounds, a single breath apart, tore into the snow. The Germans froze. The sound was wrong, alien, something they hadn't heard before. It wasn't a rifle, it was a storm. Donovan reloaded, fired again. 8 more flashes, perfectly timed. His squad watched awestruck as the Germans scattered for cover, convinced they'd stumbled into a machine gun nest. But there was no nest, just one man and one rifle that should not have existed. The farmhouse shook under return fire. Bullets splintered the beams. Donovan ducked, reloaded, and fired again. The rhythm became hypnotic. Bang, 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 bang. The mechanical heartbeat of survival. Private Brooks shouted something, but the words were lost in the chaos. Donovan couldn't hear anything now except the rifle's voice, sharp, furious, relentless. He didn't stop until the clip pinged empty and the last shell hit the floor, steaming in the cold air. Silence followed, heavy and absolute. Outside, the Germans were gone, melted back into the forest. Only the dead remained, their outlines blurred by snow. Donovan lowered the rifle and exhaled. His hands trembled not from fear, but from a realization of what he had just done. His modification, the one they called illegal, had saved them all. Night fell. The men huddled together, whispering in disbelief. "You hear that thing?" one said. "Sounded like a damned Browning." Donovan said nothing. He only cleaned the rifle, methodical as always, oiling each piece until it gleamed in the firelight. But deep inside, he knew this victory carried a price. Someone would come asking questions, and when they did, he wasn't sure he'd have the right answers. Outside, the wind carried the smell of smoke and pine. The moonlight glinted off the frozen barrels of abandoned weapons. The Battle of Bastogne was far from over, and for Donovan, the real fight was only beginning. As he lay back against the wall, eyes closing for a moment's rest, the Garand rested across his knees, silent, patient, waiting for dawn. And somewhere beyond the darkness, unseen footsteps approached through the snow. December 23rd, 1944, Bastogne, Belgium. The morning came gray and windless. The forest that had roared with gunfire only hours before now lay blanketed in a silence, so deep it felt unnatural. Sergeant Jack Donovan rose stiffly from where he had slept against the farmhouse wall, his joints aching from the cold, his eyes bloodshot from exhaustion. Outside, the snow was pocked with craters and dark stains that would never fade. His men moved quietly, speaking in low tones, as though afraid that sound itself might draw the enemy back. The rifle sat on the table, stripped down and cleaned, every piece gleaming under the weak daylight. To anyone else it looked ordinary. Another M1 Garand, government issue. But Donovan knew better. Beneath the trigger housing was the heartbeat of something forbidden. He had built it with the same care a watchmaker gives a clock, and last night it had sung. He should have felt pride. Instead, he felt the heavy weight of anticipation, the kind that comes when you know the moment of discovery is near. A knock came at the door. The sound cut through the stillness like a pistol shot. Private Brooks reached for his weapon. But Donovan already knew who it was. The door opened, and a man stepped inside, his coat dusted with frost, his collar bearing the insignia of Ordnance Command. Major Hale. He looked different from the last time Donovan had seen him. Harder, older. The lines around his eyes deepened by months of war. "Sergeant Donovan," he said quietly, glancing at the rifle on the table. "Mind telling me what in God's name you were firing out there last night?" The room fell still. The other men exchanged nervous looks. Donovan stood, the floor creaking beneath his boots. "Standard issue M1, sir," he said. Hale's eyes narrowed. "That wasn't standard issue. We heard it all the way from command post. Thought a Browning team had gone rogue. Then the reports came in, one farmhouse, 5 men, holding off a full platoon." He stepped closer, voice low. "I warned you once about that rifle." Donovan said nothing. The major picked up the weapon, inspecting it with a mechanic's familiarity. He pulled the trigger gently, feeling the resistance, then looked up. "You adjusted the sear notch again, didn't you?" Donovan hesitated, then nodded once. "It works." Hale sighed. "That's what I was afraid of." Outside, artillery thundered again, closer this time. The ground trembled, flakes of plaster falling from the ceiling. Hale turned to the window, staring into the white haze beyond. "You know, command's been desperate for anything that gives us an edge. But this," he gestured toward the rifle, "this crosses a line." He holstered the weapon and snapped the bolt open. "I'm taking this back to headquarters for review. You'll continue with your unit until further notice. No reports, no discussion. Understood?" Donovan's jaw tightened. "Understood, sir." But Hale's tone softened as he added, "You saved your men last night. Don't forget that. Not every victory gets written down." He left as quickly as he'd come, the door slamming against the wind. The farmhouse returned to silence, but it was not the same silence as before. Something had shifted, the calm before a storm of a different kind. Days passed. The siege tightened. Food ran out. Ammunition dwindled. Donovan's men joked less and prayed more. The skies over Bastogne remained thick with clouds. No supplies, no rescue. And yet, even as the Germans closed in, the soldiers whispered about that rifle, the one that roared like thunder and sent the enemy running. The story spread through the trenches like a rumor of hope. They called it the Bastogne Banshee. But Donovan felt no pride in it now. Without the weapon, he was just another rifleman waiting for the inevitable. He spent the nights staring into the dark, replaying every sound of those rapid shots, every spark that leapt from a muzzle. He knew Hale had taken it for review. He also knew what that meant. The military had ways of burying what it didn't approve of, even if it worked. Christmas came and went quiet and bitter. The snow fell harder. The men sang half a carol before falling silent again. When the relief finally broke through the lines on December 26th, they cheered not from victory, but from exhaustion. Bastogne had held, barely, and Donovan, once the man who had turned a rifle into a storm, now stood at attention as trucks rolled in to evacuate the wounded. He watched as the crates marked for ordnance were loaded onto the convoy. One of them bore a fresh stencil, Aberdeen Proving Grounds, Maryland. He recognized the serial number scrawled on its side. His rifle, his secret, his creation. 2 weeks later, back in France, Donovan found himself summoned to a makeshift courtroom inside a requisition barn. No flags, no fanfare, just a wooden table, 3 officers, and a stack of papers. The charge was simple: unauthorized modification of U.S. government weaponry. The punishment could be severe, but the tribunal never happened. Major Hale appeared again, interrupting the proceedings with a single envelope stamped classified. Whatever was in that file made the officers exchange uneasy glances. Within minutes, the charges were dropped. Donovan was reassigned to medical recovery for observation. No explanation. No CL. Osier. That night, he sat alone in his tent, staring at his hands. The same hand that had built engines, turned bolts, fixed machines. Now they shook. He felt stripped of purpose. Around him, the war went on, but for him it was over. Days later, a courier delivered an envelope to his cot. No return address. Inside was a folded piece of paper, typed on thin army stationery. It contained only one line. Your design saved more lives than you'll ever know. We're adapting it for testing. No signature. No unit. No hint of who had written it. But tucked between the folds was a photograph. Grainy, blurred, clearly taken at a testing range. Soldiers firing modified Garands. The smoke in the photo looked eerily familiar, curling like the breath of ghosts. Donovan read the message again and again. The words should have filled him with pride. Instead, they hollowed him out. If they were testing his design, it meant they had taken it from him, erased his name, and replaced it with a project number. He tried to find Major Hale again, but was told the man had been reassigned. Some said he'd been transferred back to the States. Others whispered he'd been killed when his convoy was shelled near Reims. No record. No confirmation. Just another vanishing in a war full of them. In the weeks that followed, Donovan's health deteriorated. Frostbite scarred his fingers. His eyes strained under constant fatigue. Yet even as his body weakened, his mind wouldn't rest. He began to sketch the rifle from memory, page after page. Diagrams of the trigger housing, annotations, theories for improvement. He filled an entire notebook, labeling the final page. Trigger Group V3, post-war adaptation. But he never built it again. The Army had made sure of that. By February 1945, the 101st Airborne was pulled back for regrouping. Donovan was listed as non-combat reassignable. In the final months of the war, he worked in logistics, paperwork, requisitions, the quiet death of every fighting man's spirit. Yet sometimes, during night shifts in the depot, he'd hear the echo of that rifle in his dreams, the rhythmic bursts, the impossible sound of metal defying its own limits. Years later, a rumor would circulate among surviving paratroopers that somewhere in the archives of Aberdeen, engineers had tested a rifle capable of semi-automatic fire at unprecedented speeds. They called it Project T. No names attached, no credits given. But one technician reportedly found faint initials scratched inside the trigger housing JD. Back in 1945, Donovan didn't know any of this. All he knew was that he had created something the Army feared to acknowledge, and yet they couldn't quite destroy it either. He was trapped between punishment and praise, his legacy buried under layers of classified paper. And still a part of him believed Major Hale had kept his promise, that somewhere in some hidden hangar, his rifle was being studied not as a crime, but as a key. Outside, the European winter slowly thawed. The guns fell silent. The war that had consumed the world began to shrink into memory. But for Donovan, the silence was louder than any artillery. He was sent home that spring with a medal for bravery. A generic commendation, nothing more. No mention of his modification. No record of the letter. No sign of Hale. When he arrived back in Detroit, the city was alive with parades, the streets filled with flags and brass bands. People called it victory. Donovan called it noise. He found work at a small tool and die shop near the river. The machines were familiar, comforting in their precision. Yet every sound, every clatter of steel, every spark from the lathe reminded him of that night in Bastogne, the snow, the thunder, the impossible roar of the monster Garand. Sometimes when he was alone after hours, he'd close the shop door, take out the old notebook, and trace his finger over the sketches. He'd whisper to himself, as if to an old friend, "It worked, didn't it?" The pages never answered. And somewhere thousands of miles away, a crate-marked T-20 experimental rifle, select fire, was rolled into storage under flickering fluorescent lights. Its trigger bore the same faint machining lines Donovan had filed by hand. He would never know. Detroit, 1946. The war was over. But for Sergeant Jack Donovan, peace felt like exile. The factories that once armed America now poured out toasters and cars. Men traded rifles for briefcases. Paratroopers became clerks. Yet every night, as the city's smokestacks painted the sky orange, Donovan still heard the gunfire echo in his head, that impossible rhythm of 8 shots rolling together like thunder. He rented a small apartment above a machine shop near Jefferson Avenue. The walls shook each morning when the presses started, and sometimes he smiled at the noise. Metal at least made sense. It followed rules. Men didn't. He kept to himself, rarely spoke of Bastogne. When neighbors asked about the war, he'd just say, "I fix things." That was true enough. But one winter evening, as he sat by the radio, soldering an old watch spring, the broadcast changed his life. A newsreader's voice cut through the static. The U.S. Army today revealed trials of a new experimental rifle, the T-20 series, capable of select fire operation derived from the M1 Garand. Donovan froze. The radio hummed. His hands began to shake. He knew those words, T-20 series select fire, derived from the M1. He turned up the volume, heart hammering. The announcer continued. Early tests at Aberdeen Proving Grounds showed promising accuracy. Ordnance officials believed the design could influence future service rifles. Aberdeen. He whispered the name like a ghost. That crate, that serial number, that letter with no signature. They hadn't destroyed his idea. They'd buried it under a new label. The next day, he went to the library and combed through the papers. There it was again, a grainy photograph on page 6. A soldier firing a rifle nearly identical to his own, smoke curling from the muzzle. Caption, New U.S. Select Fire Garand undergoing tests. And under the photo, 3 small words that stopped his breath. Trigger group type E2. Type E2. Exactly the notation he had written in his notebook beside the drawing labeled V3. Post-war adaptation. He stared at it for minutes before folding the paper and slipping it into his coat. That night, he didn't sleep. He walked the riverfront until dawn, the icy wind biting through his jacket. Somewhere between the factories and the water, he realized the truth. He'd built something the Army couldn't acknowledge, a weapon that came from the wrong man at the wrong time. Weeks passed. He wrote letters to Ordnance Headquarters, to Aberdeen, to anyone whose name he could find in the papers. None were answered. Each envelope returned stamped undeliverable. N.O. record of recipient. It was as if the entire project had been erased from history before it was even written. So he did what soldiers always do when the fight ends. He adapted. He worked, ate little, and drank even less. He fixed other men's tools, but never again picked up his rifle. The monster Garand was gone, but sometimes in the hiss of the drill press, he could still hear it roar. Then in 1950, a letter arrived. It wasn't official, just a folded page, no return address, postmarked Maryland. Inside, a single photograph, a test range, a rifle clamped to a stand, muzzle flash captured mid-burst. On the back, one line typed in faded ink, still saving lives. He didn't know who sent it. Major Hale? A sympathetic engineer? Or maybe someone who'd seen the scratches, J.D., inside the trigger housing. He tucked the photo into his notebook and never spoke of it again. Years turned into decades. America fought new wars, Korea, then Vietnam. And every newsreel showed soldiers carrying rifles that looked more and more familiar, shorter, lighter, faster, but all echoing the same heartbeat he'd first heard in the snow outside Bastogne. The mechanics had evolved, the materials changed, yet somewhere beneath the steel and polymer, his idea lived on, the rhythm of precision over chaos. By 1965, Donovan's hair had gone gray. He still worked at the shop, now teaching young apprentices how to read the language of metal. They called him the professor. He never talked about war, but sometimes when one of them complained that a part wouldn't fit, he'd smile faintly and say, "Everything fits when you understand the timing." One winter morning, while sweeping the floor, he heard a knock at the door. A young man in uniform stood there, Army Ordnance Corps patch on his sleeve. He introduced himself as Lieutenant Reeves, said he was visiting veterans who'd once served in the 101st Airborne. But as they spoke, Reeves's questions became oddly specific. Had Donovan ever worked with small arms prototypes? Had he been stationed near Major Hale? Did he recall any modifications to standard M1s during the winter of '44? Donovan's broom froze mid-swing. Reeves noticed. "I take it you remember him," he said softly. Donovan nodded. "Yeah, I remember." Reeves hesitated, then handed him a small folder. "Sir, you didn't hear this from me, but the Aberdeen Archives just declassified a set of T-20 design papers. They match your service number." Donovan blinked. "My service number?" "Yes, sir. There's a note handwritten. Signed J.D. Field, Modification Bastogne." The lieutenant left before Donovan could ask more. He sat alone for a long time after, staring at the folder. Inside was a photocopy of a blueprint. Trigger assembly type E2, dated January 1946. In the corner, faint but unmistakable, were the initials J.D. etched into the steel of the scanned part. His hand, his mark. After 20 years, his secret had surfaced like a shipwreck uncovered by the tide. He laughed, a quiet, broken laugh that turned into tears. Not for recognition, not for revenge, but for proof. Proof that what he'd built in the dark had reached the light. That night he opened his notebook, yellowed with age, and compared his sketches to blueprint. Every line matched, every curve identical. He placed a photo from 1950 next to it, the rifle midburst, and whispered, "Still saving lives." Then he closed the book and locked away. 2 years later, in 1967, Donovan passed away quietly in his sleep. When the landlord cleaned the apartment, he found only one box labeled tools and personal effects. Inside were wrenches, an army dog tag, and the worn notebook bound with twine. The landlord handed it to a local veterans museum. It sat in a storage room for decades, gathering dust. 1983, Aberdeen Proving Grounds, Maryland. During an inventory of old ordnance crates, a technician pried open a wooden box marked T22. Select fire. Do not discard. Inside lay a rusted rifle, the wood cracked, the metal scarred by time. As the technician cleaned the receiver, he found letters scratched faintly into the trigger housing. J.D. The initials matched a name scribbled in pencil on a yellowing test log from 1946. Sergeant Jack Donovan, 101st Airborne. The discovery was noted in the archives but never publicized. No press release, no ceremony, just a single line in a maintenance record. Trigger assembly appears field modified. Performance exceeded expectations. The file was closed again, marked historical sample, retained for reference. But legends have a way of leaking through cracks. Years later, collectors and historians began whispering about a Bastogne prototype, a lost Garand that could fire faster than any semi-auto of its era. Some dismissed it as myth. Others swore they'd seen the test photos. A few claimed the rifle still existed, locked in the deepest level of Aberdeen's museum vaults. No one could prove it. And yet, the story endured, passed among veterans, told around campfires, written in footnotes. Because somewhere in that frozen farmhouse, one man had changed the rhythm of war with nothing but a file, a spring, and the refusal to accept limitations. Back to Bastogne. If you stand on that same road today, the farmhouse is gone, replaced by a small stone marker covered in moss. Tourists pass it without stopping. But on certain cold mornings when the wind sweeps down from the Ardennes and the snow drifts just right, locals say you can still hear it. The echo of a rifle firing far too fast for its time. A burst of 8 shots that sound like thunder rolling through history. Jack Donovan's name never made it into the textbooks, but his fingerprints rest on every trigger refined after 1945, every soldier's rifle that cycles smoother, faster, truer. He never sought glory. He sought precision, and found immortality instead. The war had many heroes. Some wore medals, others carried secrets. Donovan's legacy was neither invention nor rebellion. It was proof that sometimes the line between genius and insubordination is drawn only by those too afraid to cross it. So the next time you hear the metallic ping of an M1 clip ejecting, remember the machinist who listened to metal like music and made it sing louder than any gun should. Because in the snows of Bastogne, courage didn't always wear stripes. Sometimes it wore grease-stained gloves and carried a file in its pocket. And that's how one forgotten sniper turned a standard rifle into a legend. If stories like this remind you that innovation and courage can change the course of history, do one small thing before you go. Please share this video, like it, and subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends. Tell us where you're watching from around the world in the comments: Texas, London, Sydney, Manila. We read every single one. Your support keeps these hidden chapters of bravery alive for future generations. Together, we make sure names like Jack Donovan are never lost in the snow.